Hi, this is Paul. Jordan Peterson dropped a Q&A just over this weekend, and I thought the first section, the section that he had about religion, was absolutely clear. Now, it could be that I'm just continuing to sort of figure out what Jordan Peterson has been trying to say over these last 3 years. It could be that he is continuing to be able to, is developing clarity with respect to what he thinks religion is. But in either case, I thought that this first answer that he gave to three questions was absolutely helpful in understanding where he's at. And I think he's always been here. I know that there's this game that religious people play about him moving. I don't think he's moved a lot. When I think about the answer he gives here, I think this is very similar to the answer that he's always given. And as we go through the answer, I'm going to point out why. So let's begin.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to my Q&A. I'm answering questions today that were submitted on the in-beta stage social media platform ThinkSpot, which I had a hand in developing over the last few years as an alternative to Patreon, although others have contributed far more. These answers...
Now, ThinkSpot has been around a little while now. This was the platform when he got off Patreon he said he was going to get onto. I have no idea how well that platform is doing. I know Jordan is on there, Jonathan Peugeot is on there, Bishop Barron is on there. There's a few other people. When it first came out, I thought about approaching them. You know, my channel's not that big, to see if they would be interested in having me on there, but I didn't really see the upside in terms of putting my stuff on there. Already you can find my stuff on YouTube and also Library, which is now Odyssey. If you don't like advertisements and you want to watch my videos, everything that I put on YouTube goes up there. My audio goes out onto my audio only podcast, so that's available, and that is also without commercials. So I don't really have a sense of what to think about ThinkSpot in terms of its importance. I think Substack has certainly made a splash, and so I recently started a Substack, and so I'm using Substack for some smaller thoughts that I have. Some things that I write on Substack might become videos. Often what I do is I send out a little thread of tweets and then post that on Substack, usually with a few additional comments. So all of this for me has always been figuring out how to think out loud and think with you. So so ThinkSpot, I don't know, apparently it was on ThinkSpot before this. There's just that not that many places I go to check, and with each additional social media platform it becomes another place to check. And unless I construct sort of an RSS feed, if some of these platforms are feeding to an RSS feed, I don't know that I want to go around checking all these places for new content. So this dropped, and again,
were posted on ThinkSpot before their release on YouTube. So if you want an earlier view of such things, you might consider checking out the ThinkSpot platform. I've edited the questions a bit and grouped some of them together so I can address the broader topic. I hope you find this worthwhile and interesting.
Now, I like the fact that we're playing around with the question and answer format, and I hope that he does get back to some of the other question and answer formats. Question and answer formats are a good format for him, and I like doing them on the Bridges of Meaning Discord. Jonathan Peugeot does them. He accumulates the questions from Patreon and Subscribestar, and he sort of has his own platform that he's been putting together. So it's interesting to watch this format continue to develop. And the fact that he went through the questions, kind of grouped them together, and is answering them. Those of you who follow my question and answer in the Bridges of Meaning, I'm not that organized, but it does happen that the first questions I do sort of meld into the other questions, and it becomes something of a narrative as we go down.
I also hope to start live Q&As at some point again in the future when I'm healthier and sharper. I would like to know how to believe in the divine, even though it is a loose end. I know without some sort of grounding, any hope about a positive future falls down. Could you please tell us how your conception of God has changed in the last year or two? And has your wife's burgeoning faith had an impact on this conception?
Now, back to the first question, and the way he answers this is very interesting. And again, I was very excited when I listened to this last night. I listened to it while I was folding laundry, but I knew this was going to be top of my list in terms of video commentary and video making, because it is really good. Now, the first question, the conceptualization of the divine, we use all these circumlocutions to avoid saying God. Fair enough. The ineffable, I just had a conversation this morning with Mark Lefebvre, and over there at the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord server, they always use the ineffable because they kept talking about God, and that kept annoying people. People get reactive to the word God. Okay, well, thousands and thousands of years, I can understand some reactivity, but the divine, so right there, it's kind of we're using it as a categorical. Now, key to understanding Peterson on these topics has always been he works from the bottom. He always works from the bottom. That's how he approaches it when he's speaking psychologically. Same for all his biblical series. He is in that way sort of building a Tower of Babel of sorts as he's working his way up to God. And I don't mean that dismissively or pejoratively, but that is the method that he is using. He is attempting to understand the world from us up, whereas most religious people, my conversation with Mark Lefebvre this morning was interesting because it got me thinking about a bunch of lines more than I could articulate during one conversation. But one of the points that Mark made repeatedly, which I think he's right at, is modernity is both a product of Christianity and increasingly Christians think modernistically. And so I think in many ways, part of the difference between Jordan Peterson and talking to most Christians is that Christians attempt to speak from a God's eye view. And because of the buffered self, because of secularity, that is met with deep skepticism. Because, well, why should I believe you? And it's sort of Israel's answer to Moses when he comes back from the desert and says, God has spoken to me and he's going to take you out of Egypt. Well, all right. And so skepticism, moderns or postmoderns don't have a corner on skepticism at all. But, okay, let's keep going.
Rather taken aback when you said in your burgeoning faith had an impact on changed in the last year or two. Could you please tell us how your conception of God has changed in the last year or two? And has your wife's burgeoning faith had an impact on this conception? I was rather taken aback when you said in your return home video posted 5 months ago that with the grace and mercy of God, you might be able to generate original material once again.
A lot of us were taken back when he said that, because that is, again, sort of in secularity, you sort of have the religious and the non-religious. And again, that conceptualization is a product of secularity. All right. And so when he said that, he sort of put himself over in the religious camp. So I would imagine a lot of people who listen to him from an atheistic camp, not an anti-theist camp, but from an atheistic camp, sort of carve out this religion that's not a religion, to borrow a phrase, sort of carve out this space in which, well, God and everything's going to fit into this, but, and this is where, again, I think we have God number one and God number two. It's all God number one, and I'll be fine with God number one. And I think I increasingly see the need for a God concept in my system, for my system to work and for my life to work. And I think that's exactly where a lot of people are at right now. They see a need for a God to work in their system in their philosophical worldview, but this God needs to remain part of a structure. It's God number one only. And the idea of God number two, that is an active agent. And, this is something that I'll probably have to continue to get deep into, because agency is a very tricky business. And that's part of why the conversations with Vervaeke are very interesting, because that is the line that people are skittish of. And in a Substack piece that I wrote looking at the importance of Peugeot's work, which is another video I want to make this week, part of the reason Peugeot, I think, is popular is because his talk about patterns feels very God number one-ish. It's a God that we can take or leave. It's a God that won't reach through and grab us and pull us over the line. And even when we have an experience of that, we can explain that with all of our psychological ideas, which feel safely in the buffered self box. And when you think about what happened, described in a book that Jordan Peterson recommended, The Metaphysical Club, which, and I've read this quote from this book many, many times over the last 3 years in my videos, that the key transformation that happened with Darwin is that you no longer needed a God number two, an active agency that reaches into history and does things the way a human being reaches into a terrarium and moves things around, or the way a rancher takes the bull and puts it with a certain cow in order to produce children. Now that you no longer need that God because Darwin explains that everything can happen without that agent, well, now we can safely live without God. We have our buffered self. But increasingly, as our view of the universe becomes more complex, then we need a more complex reality. And so Jonathan Peugeot, even again, though Jonathan Peugeot is a full believer in God number one and two, which Rationality Rules figured out when he said, you're not the one who believes in, there's the line, there's the line. And Jordan Peterson, as I thought it was an excellent video that Rationality Rules made, noted that Jordan Peterson goes right to the line and stops. And he sort of builds a ladder, and others walk up the ladder and say, oh, I'll keep going. I'll keep going because it's more fun, because I'm not necessarily going to lose status, because I think it's actually better if, in Tom Holland's words, I live into the game, if I live into that world. So this is, and again, the question that we sort of keep having with Jordan Peterson as he builds up this system and he builds this stairway to heaven is, how high can he go? And I think that's somehow Jordan's way. Now, when it comes to his wife, she's more like everyone else and like, I'll just keep going up the stairs. And there's that little line that says, that's C.S. Lewis's, when it's not you looking for God, it's God looking for you. His wife just steps right over that line and keeps going like most normies do. But Jordan, well, speaking as a psychologist, I'm at least publicly, whether, when no one is looking, I'll cross over the line and then step back when I do my biblical series. How far can I push that line? That's the real thing. That's what Jordan is doing, and that's why people are intrigued by him with this question. And it's interesting because, again, unlike my Q&A, where I just kind of take the next question because I'm a disorganized slob, Jordan looks at all of these things and, this is the first question that he picks. And any YouTuber knows that, well, you look at that, the audience that you lose throughout your video, sometimes you don't bury the lead. You put the most important thing first. And it's interesting that this is what Jordan put first.
Why do you think there are so many people who are prone to just following an ideology seemingly blindly today, especially in America and maybe especially among younger people? Why do people seem to cling to what a doctor, an organization, or a political stance, or what a news network or source says seemingly religiously. I'm not talking about religion specifically, I don't think, but maybe what I seem to see as replacements for faith or a good family / meaningful life, etc.
Very interesting that he decided to include that question with this cluster.
Having listened to you for many years now and as minor clergy in the Orthodox Church, my questions are, have you attended any services in the Eastern Orthodox churches? Or
he answered that, and his wife sort of liked it, and he squirmed, which I totally believe.
have you done an in-depth exploration of Eastern Orthodox Christianity? How do you respond to the idea that your personal theology aligns so well with what is taught by the Eastern Orthodox churches? Well, I'm going to try to answer all those questions at the same time. Let's start with the third set. Why do you think there are so many people who are prone to just following an ideology seemingly blindly today, especially in America?
Now, why does he start with that question? Because he's going to frame the religious questions with this universal human need for, and he'll start with basically a religious framing.
And maybe especially among younger people. Why do people cling to what a doctor, etc., says seemingly religiously? Well, I would say that something has to be done with the religious impulse. So, and we could think about what the religious impulse is critically and deeply for a minute. So imagine that you might consider defining the religious impulse as the consequence of the necessity of having a goal at the highest possible level of conceptualization and organization.
Okay. With a lot of his answers, now some of you are going to say, well, you're really annoying when you pause the video and then talk. Okay, if you are at that point in this video and you've gotten this far and you're not already too annoyed by me talking, stop this video and go to his question and answer May 1 video on his channel. It has about 100 times more views than this one. So go to that one and listen. I'm not in that video at all. I don't interrupt not once. Okay? So just fair warning, because there'll be interruptions. Okay. Here you see a commonality between Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau in terms of the necessity and inevitability of hierarchies. All right? Because that's where we begin. Because a theoretical hierarchy, a value hierarchy, and that's why Sevilla King has continued in this conversation, these are necessary because that's how the world works.
So imagine that you might consider defining the religious impulse as the consequence of the necessity of having a goal at the highest possible level of conceptualization and organization.
Now, you might not have one articulated, explicit. In fact, the vast majority of people don't. And I know this as a pastor, if you sort of start to ask questions to figure out what theirs might be, it's a theoretical goal, it's a conceptualization, but that is something that at least theoretically, in terms of our view of the world, you might have, which actually makes sense of the world. Now, again, I thought a really good conversation with Mark Lefebvre, which I'm planning on releasing this video on Tuesday. And so my conversation with Mark will be on Wednesday, because I like to sort of not have too many different kinds of videos in a row, do some conversations and then do some monologues and commentaries, etc., etc. We outsource this cognition to religion, as Mark says, and I think he's exactly right. Now, we don't sit down as a 5-year-old and say, I'm going to outsource my cognition to a religion. We naturally do this because we are developing our first drafts They are imprinted from our families, and we're developing our first drafts. And that happens like in the household that we grew up in. And then you begin to watch movies. You begin to get socialized. That's happening all around us as part of our ethical system. This is how we grow and develop and how our systems are formed. Okay. And they will, one way or another, an implicit hierarchy will develop of values within them. Again, 5- and 6-year-olds don't know this. 50-year-olds don't know this. These values get programmed into us as sort of algorithms that we just kind of keep running. But the religious, that word, not in terms of, oh, religious is stuff that has to do with God. It's much more religious is the things of ultimate concern. The biggest worldview questions are what we're talking about here. And there's a theoretical structure within us. Peterson, values is one way into this. There's a theoretical value structure built into us. In fact, not just built into us as individuals, built into us as communities, built into us as societies, built into us as cultures. All of this is what we are immersed in, and in many ways, we are expressions of those far bigger mappings and values. That's what a human being is. I know I'm scaring some of you. I thought I was an autonomous individual that acted out my secret, sacred self and is a totally unique, yeah, that's you. But you think everybody else is a non-player character. Right. So this first part where Peterson is saying is that let's first define what a religion is. This is what it's the largest categorical framing of the world for us, okay? And one way into it is a value system, and it will lay itself out as a hierarchy.
Psychological organization, social organization. We have goals on a daily basis and a weekly basis and a monthly basis, and personal goals and familial goals and social goals, but
now, those goals might not be explicit. Those goals are likely implicit and built into us from the time we were children by the implicit goals of our parents and their parents and then parents and their parents, always tweaked and modified and changed by the environment, but down, all the way down to you. That's the programming of you, some of which has, over great periods of time, gotten built into your biological nature, but is also built into you culturally. And that's when Brett Weinstein talks about 2 tracks. You have the culture track and the genetic track. And there may be more. Meaning Code sent me a video today. I watched 3 or 4 minutes of it, and she said, you're not going to watch much of this video, and you're going to really be all over this. And I thought, that's a big thing to say. We'll see. And I watched a few minutes, and it's like, she might be right. So anyway, here we go.
All of that has to be nested in the broader world of value. Let's say all of that has to be nested within something like, well, what is the ultimate goal? What is the final goal underneath which...
Now, what is the ultimate goal? What is the final goal? Now, again, this is where we're bumping up into the predominant worldview in the Western world, which says there is no ultimate goal. There is no final goal. There is no purpose. There is no meaning of life. None exists. It's just matter and, information. Yeah, but once you open that door to information, you're letting the horse out. But there is no purpose. There is no telos. There's nothing like that outside the system. Okay, read C.S. Lewis's Miracles. There's nothing out there. All there is. And then go back to 2-level theories, is and ought. All there is. But human beings can't run that way. We have to run within the manifest image. So we actually do develop these things. Now, these hierarchies, these value hierarchies that get expressed in goals, and they're implicit. And so every morning I I go to bed at a certain hour and I wake up at a certain hour and I take care of my body and I pay my bills and I maintain my relationships with my family and I maintain my job and I just program. And these are all nested in this huge goal, even if I'm unaware of what exactly the big goal is. Now, again, someone might say, well, all this goal stuff, that's just all, you're just projecting that onto yourself. Well, yeah, but someone watching would probably say, I can sort of organize that person's life in that framework. And that organization makes sense of it. And again, that this entire way of organizing something is, in many ways, a massively powerful compression algorithm to take the near infinite amount of detail in every individual life and then in all of their lives nested together all the way out throughout the history of the universe and say, making sense of it. Okay? So those who are skeptical about this whole thing. And he's saying that's religion. That's the religion. That's the religious frame.
All of those more proximal goals, is, let's say, all of that has to be nested within something like, well, what is the ultimate goal? What is the final goal underneath which all of those more proximal goals are subsumed? And that becomes a religious question, I would say, by definition.
Now, again, notice he is not defining religion as God stuff or supernatural. He is pretty much taking a sociological definition of religion. And as I said before, this is all being worked up from the ground below. Different from most Christians that start on top and start with the God and the conceptualization of this God. He's starting down below here.
It's an impossible question to answer in some sense, because to provide a definitive answer would mean that we would have to possess the classic attributes of God.
See, he's saying a definitive answer you'd have to see it from above. You'd have to possess the monarchical vision. You would have to know everything and see everything and be outside the system to possess that all. And so he's aware of modernistic religion that sees in this particular way. And he says, now, we really can't do that, but
at least his omniscience to be able to finally answer, well, what is it all for? But we're still stuck with the necessity of identifying the highest level goal.
So even if you're skeptical that any of all of this is for anything, in order to work in the manifest image, you need to think about what's it all for. And you'll have proximal what it's all for, even if the meaning of life, 64. Even if you announce skeptically that we can't get the big picture, so I'm just going to live in my little iron box of secularism, in my little buffered self, but I'm going to use all of these things, because without all of these things, the whole meaning game is no fun, and my biological system is emerged as a result of this meaning game.
And that's really that the identification of that goal was exactly what our traditional religious structures were attempting to do, for better or worse. And
so what did religious structures do? They gave you answers. Now, again, today's video is like, now, I don't have a lot of confidence I can talk to Christians because they're so dogmatic. Well, they actually have answers and a system that they are working from. And the reason, John Vervaeke repeatedly reminds me that, well, a lot of the benefits of religion seem sort of blind to some of the contents of religion. Because if you have a really stupid religion, or a really bloodthirsty religion, and there have been many, or, they are in competition with each other, and the differences will be found over great amounts of time. But religious systems are basically set programs that have proven themselves to be relatively sustainable and durable over long periods of time. And again, now remember, we're talking from below up here. That's the direction that this is going.
They did that with practice and with ritual and with drama and with symbolism and with music and with art. And
in other words, back to first biblical series, they acted it out. In other words, they didn't have it necessarily, the vast majority of them didn't have this necessarily as a consciousness conceptualization. In churches, for example, in the Roman Catholic Church and in Protestant churches, you had catechisms, which were an attempt to sort of download a framework into people out of which they could live. So, they have all the stuff at the bottom, and then you get a few things at the top, and over time you sort of fill in the middle. A lot of times, a lot of it wasn't conscious. You go to church on Sunday, and Mark Lefebvre, so a lot of his context is sort of nominal Catholic. I grew up in the Christian Reformed Church. My wife grew up in a Lutheran church, and when we were in Michigan at one point in our lives training for missionary service, we visited a Lutheran church, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know when to stand up. I didn't know when to sit down. They had all these rote sayings, and my wife, who, had been with me going to a Christian Reformed church, we went to this Lutheran church. I just watched her. She stood up, sat down, stood up, sit down, knew all the words to say. That had been programmed into her when she was a child. I had a different program. Went to a Christian Reformed church. I knew when to stand up and sit down and knew the words to say because that had been programmed into me as a child. And this goes out and out and out and out and out. And a lot of it, again, we're not conscious of it. If I were to sit down with my wife and say, now tell me exactly when we're going to have to stand up and sit down and what we're going to have to say in this Lutheran service, she'd be like, well, let me think. And she would imaginatively go back into that Lutheran church that she grew up in, and she would have thought about, okay, and it would be kind of hard, kind of fuzzy. Well, then we did this, and when we did that, and I'm not sure. But then once she got into the building, and once the liturgy started, she would know exactly what to do. Because, oh, yeah, now we do this, now we do that. In fact, we sometimes call it muscle memory. It just would have happened. And it's just like shooting a free throw or a lot of sports and athletic activity. You don't wait for your slow, conscious mind in order to do what you need to do because you've already been programmed.
With literature, with dance, all of which are integrated in more archaic communities, let's say.
Non-Protestant communities, because this is a big part of the Protestant Reformation in terms of what happens with a lot of these things.
Those were all our attempts to orient ourselves at the highest possible level of being.
I'd say orient ourselves with the highest level being.
Perhaps we're all striving to be, at least in our more noble moments, we're trying to be good people ethically and to serve.
And now what's interesting is he often sort of breaks down into it's not really a Manichaeism. Is it a Zoroastrian? It's a dualism, good, bad, right, wrong. And that's often he'll say, well, that's the lowest level, but that lowest level is part of this system because good is that which it's sort of the difference between a center set and a bounded set. Centered set is always sort of directional. Are we reaching the goal? Are we moving towards the goal or away from the goal? Bounded set is here is the mapped area and here are the boundaries in or out. Okay. So good is this moving us towards the highest level? Bad is this moving us away from the lowest level?
The good, whatever that might be. And it's the religious domain that strives to answer those questions at the highest possible level of abstraction. Now, if you lack that answer, if you're divorced from a religious structure, then you have to find a replacement somewhere because the question isn't going to go away.
And what happens in a secular society, a la Tom Holland's work, there was sort of the formed, specifically Christian answer, and then there were sort of the folk answers down the line. And so instead of necessarily having a doctrine of providence or sowing and reaping, you'd have what goes around comes around. And instead of having a doctrine of providence, you'd have everything happens for a reason. And so what you wind up with are all of these sort of folk sayings that are stand-ins for religious doctrines that had been in the community before and had been worked into the systems. Over 90 today in Sacramento. Time to get the fan out.
The question, what's it all for? Or what should I orient myself toward? Or what should I imitate? Or what should I be in awe of? You're stuck with that. Or even in its negative sense, well, what's the purpose of life anyways? And why bother? And so that can...
Now, again, a lot of people don't sit and ponder that explicitly. They just sort of keep running the little sub-programs. And as long as their life is busy and they're getting enough little meaning, little shots of meaning from the sub-programs, well, that'll be enough for some people. But then there's always these, and a lot of you are like that. You're just sort of, you're probably high in intelligence and you're high in abstraction and you've got a lot of elements there. And actually later in this video, he's got a couple of really interesting things to say that I'm going to have to track down again about when he was in his practice, what he noticed about different kinds of people and their conceptualizations along this line. I'll have to track that down, but not right now.
Lead you into a very destructive nihilism. And so you're stuck with the problem. And if your culture hasn't provided you with a solution, or you've rejected that solution, or the solution no longer seems tenable to you, maybe because it's fallen prey to a rationalist critique, that...
He kind of said Sam Harris there.
Doesn't mean the problem goes away. You find a replacement for it. And
Clay Rutledge, where, well, just because you give up on the formal religions doesn't mean you give up on religion in the big way he's talking. You just substitute all sorts of things, like talk about karma if you're a Westerner and you never know anything about the Hindu doctrine of karma, that just what goes around comes around and everything happens for a reason. And all these lower level little folk things that you manage your life with, instead of actually a system that thousands of people over centuries have sort of thought through and put out. And yeah, it has some elements that may not quite fit today in terms of language and philosophy changes and language changes, but it's actually something that's semi-coherent. You don't want to be bothered with that, and instead you're going to let whatever writers of the latest thing on Netflix think, and you're just going to sort of absorb that system into you.
And for better or for worse. Now, the first of the set of questions I grouped together, we'll turn to it, was, I would like to know how to believe in the divine, even though it's a loose end.
So you can see he begins with this question of ideology, and he doesn't really answer it directly, but he basically says, well, as he says, many ideologies are sort of crippled religions. Well, how are they crippled? What is a cripple? A cripple is someone who has legs but can't run. And ideologies have legs, but they can't run. And so he kind of says, you need to learn what those legs are for, because those legs are for something. And therefore actually having a coherent system. Well, how do you know if your system is coherent, and what is the benefit of that coherence? The benefit of that coherence is that your life will actually work. And not only your life, but the lives around you, and your civilization will actually work. And the better the implicit religion behind the civilization, the more successful that civilization is going to become. Well, how can we gauge the value of that civilization? And Peterson would say, because it outcompetes the other civilizations. Because remember, he's a thoroughgoing Darwinian. That's the basis of this argument that he makes.
Well, it is and it isn't. I'll answer that in relationship also to, could you please tell us how your conception of God has changed in the last year or two? Well, one thing I've been thinking about lately is the idea of thought as a dialectical process. So imagine that you posit a question in your imagination. Your life presents you with a question. What should I do today?
Let's go back and listen to that again. I was distracted. Is he wearing a hearing aid? Because he's not talking to anybody in this video. So I don't know. It's, again, one of these random things that comes into my head and my mouth brimmeth over.
What we're thought as a thinking about lately is the idea of thought as a dialectical process. So,
right, thought as a dialectical process. What does he mean by that? What's a dialectical? It's back and forth. Now he's going to talk to Vervaeke, and Vervaeke's going to, Vervaeke's big offering is dialogos, where we're outsourcing our cognition together, and we're coming into this place together, and we both hope to leave from this place with something we didn't have before. And that fits very well with Jordan's idea that, the same mechanisms in our brain that look for food, look for knowledge. And so we come together and we eat together, but then we also come together and we eat off the world in terms of we're eating knowledge and information off the world. And because it's just kind of out there in the world, and sometimes we can sort of do our own knowledge farming ourselves. It's a little easier if someone who's also done some knowledge farming can share a little bit, because it's already been refined to a degree, and then I'll take that and I'll give something back. And so so that's the dialogue, but a dialectic, thesis, synthesis, or thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And when we do this consciously in ourselves, sometimes we imagine it as two little voices, or an angel and a demon, or we're having a conversation with ourselves, but often we do that with each other. And I'm doing it with a camera via YouTube, doing it with you, and you'll answer in the comment section, and then maybe we'll have a conversation if you grab a rando slot, on and on and on.
Imagine that you posit a question in your imagination. Your life presents you with a question. What should I do today? What would a person do? What should a person do in this situation? What should I do with my life? What should I do with this relationship? And
in other words, we get to these second level questions, and how are we going to figure them out? Well, we sort of have to, and it's an amazing thing, because a lot of our brain just comes to conclusions, and that communicates to us via feelings. But there's this section that we have in our conscious self where we come up with an answer, and then we sort of it becomes a representation, and we sort of talk to the representation.
Answers appear in the theater of your imagination.
Okay, and so that's what answers appear. The rest of the Consciousness Congress is, they send in a note. It's, think about maybe those vacuum tubes. It's like, open it up. It's revelation. It comes from I don't know where. Now, again, you got to be careful here, because Christians sort of in the modern frames kind of, okay, well, this is God. Okay. Peterson, it's the vacuum tube is coming from below. Oh, where did this come from? Well, it came from someplace else. But now Peterson's a Jungian, so he doesn't have quite those fixed borders around our skull like a lot of other people do. It's more connected, and it's more communal.
Or doubts arise, but something happens. You send out a call, essentially, and you respond, or something in you responds with the generation of an answer, or maybe multiple answers. And in the case of multiple answers, you can then undertake an argument in your head. That's the dialectical process between
the argument in your head,
the two positions that might have emerged in the course of these revealed answers.
So two little vacuum tubes came, one had one answer, one had the other answer, and sort of in your brain, you talk it back and forth.
So there's a revelatory element to thought, which is the appearance of new information in the theater of your imagination. And then there's a dialectical element, which is the combat between different revealed thoughts to evaluate them and rank order them in terms of their credibility and applicability.
There you have your hierarchy.
Okay, so now imagine that we have that faculty. We have the faculty for revelation, and we have the faculty for dialectical thought. Now, imagine.
Now, again, for you religious people out there, when he says revelation, something inside of you says, well, because you've already got this program. You've already got this framework. This was given to you. This was inherited. And even if formally you rejected it, it's still built into you pretty deep. It doesn't just go away. He's like, well, I've deconstructed. It just doesn't go away that fast. And the more you watch yourself, the more you learn that, whether you liked it or not, that was built into you. So the revelation, whether the revelation is from however you conceptualize it, he's speaking phenomenologically. It's just like, boop, the vacuum tube comes in, you open the cylinder, and there's a message, or a message in a bottle, or, it's revelation. Pow, there it is. And the dialectic, well, we got this one, and then we got this one, so they're going to battle it out, and we're going to use reason and all these other faculties that we have to come up with, in terms of the hierarchy, how they're nested and how they're structured and which has priority.
That you formulate in your imagination, or perhaps your culture helps you formulate, the image of an ideal being. And that might be God as such, but it also might be, say, in the case of Christianity with Christ, or Buddhism with Buddha. Or
okay, now we have sort of a God number two. Not necessarily, but something that's a person. It's an agent. It's a being. It's something like me that I represent out on the world. Might be a god, might be a historical person, but that's where this goes.
Islam with Muhammad, the idea of a person who's divine in some important manner.
Ooh. Muhammad is a prophet. I mean, those are, see, in that mapping in the Islamic world, there's some real sensitivity over there. Okay, Muhammad is not divine. Muhammad is a prophet. The Buddha is not divine. And that's where some of the first question, the divine, the circumlocution, is a way to avoid triggering, but there's no real avoiding triggering a lot of the stuff.
Which brings the divinity down to earth. In any case, whether the imaginary being in the theater of your imagination is purely divine, God himself, or incarnated in some sense in a human figure, it enables you to produce an avatar of your imagination with whom you can converse.
What would Jesus do?
And so you could ask yourself, you can ask yourself such questions as if you're plagued by doubts about what you should do in a situation is, well, what would you do if you were trying to do the best possible thing? Or what would someone who was always striving to do the best possible thing do? You formulate that question and you might get an answer that this is the proper pathway forward. Now, that doesn't mean...
Now, in some ways, conversing with your consciousness Congress, where these vacuum tubes come and you get the revelation, is like talking to God. And a lot of people have that experience. Now, again, in the modern frame, in the buffered self, we're very skeptical about that. But that's what we're doing.
You'd be necessarily inclined to implement that. It might be too difficult, or maybe you even might doubt that that's a practical way forward. But not only can you produce avatars in your imagination and then use them as sources of revealed thought, but your culture can fill in the attributes of that.
We're not doing this alone, because that revealed thought that you have isn't just in you. It's been all of the mappings that you've had from your parents and the movies and the stories and the culture, and all of those layers are in you.
Avatar. So, for example, if you're Christian and you've been taught about the life of Christ as it's portrayed in the Gospels, all those descriptions flesh out the personality. And then, of course, the image of Christ is reflected in Western culture in a multitude of ways, all of which inform the structure of that internal avatar and which, in principle, flesh it out so that it's the potential source of revealed truth in imagination.
You got a little loop there. Now, again, he's starting from below. That, well, how do you, he talks to Sam Harris, and you sit on the edge of your bed, and you ask the universe a question. A question will come up. And even Sam Harris says, we don't know where it comes from. Well, there you go. And so now he's saying, well, you go back to my videos from a few weeks ago, the story inside and the story outside. And, well, Carl Jung goes to the medical hospital, and he's a young doctor, and the senior doctors say, don't bother talking to any of the crazy people. They're crazy. And he's like, yeah, but aren't we supposed to help them? No, they can't be helped. Well, what am I going to do? Might as well talk to him. And he begins to understand that the myths and all of the stories out there in the culture, and all of the stories, represented by the stars in the sky, and all of the stories that they're awash, and the story that they're on the inside, well, they're all intertwined, and I'm one character in a far bigger story, and this conceptualization just keeps happening. So then, if you have a representation of the divine that's somehow in the story, and that happens at all different levels. If you read Christian Smith's Soul Searching, dyslexic, I can never know what direction anything go. Soul Searching, how many young people say, I learn what's right and wrong from mom and dad? Now, they do learn what's right and wrong from mom and dad. Sometimes it's because mom and dad are right, and sometimes it's because they feel mom and dad are wrong and they're pushing against it. One way or another, but they're comparing mom and dad with other moms and dads and other people and other stories and this whole thing. So all of that is happening.
Buttressed by all that cultural truth which inform the structure of that internal avatar, and which in principle flesh it out so that it's the potential source of revealed truth in imagination.
Interesting little smile there, because I think he knows sort of what's going on when he says something like that, because, well, he's within the iron box there, and he's just basically made an argument that it can all be from below. It's sort of a Darwinian argument in the impact that, I'm making the case you can have all the religion from below without God.
Buttressed by all that cultural input. And so you would say, well, in some ways, that avatar with whom you can converse is now the internal embodiment of all the ideas about what constitutes the highest good that our entire culture has been able to create and communicate, insofar as you've been exposed to that or are able to understand it.
That's a massive compression, okay? That's, in a sense, in order to move around in the world, you need a picture of the world, and you need a picture of what is good in the world in order to move around in the world, and this is what you're doing.
And then, so you could imagine that could be of substantial practical worth, regardless of the ontological reality of that avatar of your imagination. But then I don't think that the issue necessarily ends there, because you can then ask yourself, well, does that imaginary avatar share in any real being? And then you ask yourself, well,
Now, when he talked with Peugeot, make sure I'm using this mic. When he talked with Peugeot about sort of the storyverse and the matterverse, he didn't use those languages. This is where these things get connected, because, okay, I've got this avatar and I'm looking at the world, and this is my worldview, this is my picture of the world, and via this avatar, it's this massive compression scheme by which I relate to the world, and I can have a mapping which is actually practical and useful for me in order to navigate the world, and I do this in a societal context, in a culture, and all of that just gets nested out all the way out to the frame. And, well, here's the question. Does it touch the world of stuff? And this is where, again, this whole area is a big part of the rise of Jordan Peterson.
Is there anything real about the hypothetical ideal?
What does he mean by real? Does it move matter? Because for modernists, matter and real are really close together, because materialism basically says that matter is the most basic level of reality. It's the level that doesn't change. Now he's not saying that, but that's nested in the language that he's using, because we have to use language together that we can understand. And for his audience, that's how it'll be heard.
And it seems to me that there is something real about the hypothetical ideal. We recognize its manifestation in other people, and we're happy about that. We're inspired by that. We might be in awe of that. We certainly recognize it as a good thing. We're pleased when that manifests itself in us. Its manifestation in us certainly makes us more attractive to other people. And also, I would say, of more use to other people, and also more likely to be truthful and perhaps able to take proper care of and love other people.
And now you can, and this again is where his Darwinian ideas work, because, well, they've been tried again and again and again and again over time, and so they're battle tested and they're time tested, and everyone in the community sort of has mappings close enough to each other so that they can sort of talk to each other. And so in the midst of our pervasive skepticism about how we can know anything, this is as good a bet as anything.
And I don't think any of that isn't real. And so that means that there's some relationship between the imaginary ideal and reality itself that's not trivial. And I don't know what that might mean in the final analysis.
Which is where, again, go back to his conversation with Jonathan Peugeot about, well, and his conversation with Michael Shermer. And this is, again, he always goes here. He does this again and again. And when he talks about this stuff, he's always running these same trails. Now, there's always these little variations, but this is how he thinks. This is how he chooses to talk. And he does not talk like someone like Bishop Barron, who comes from on top. Talk starts with God. He starts down below and is building up this edifice to see how the stairway to heaven, to see how high he can build it.
You have a God in the imagination, which is our conception of God. And does that bear any relationship to the real God, or indicate that there is a real God? And
I mean, a lot of this stuff, you just kind of slow it down and think about it when he says.
The answer to that is, we don't know.
Again, I've learned a ton over these last 3 years, but he remains an open agnostic. We don't know. We don't know scientifically. Well, but but then you still have to act. We are always having to act, even if we don't know to this standard of certainty that we sort of like to play with.
I wouldn't dismiss the idea so rapidly. So that's pretty much. Now, there's some.
That's his answer. You can watch him talking to Tim Lott about the resurrection. That's his answer. The lectures that he gave so many of them in Australia that dealt with this. This is his answer. This is his answer. Hasn't changed.
Something else, I guess. How do I respond to the idea that my personal theology aligns so well with what is taught by the Eastern Orthodox churches? Well, I don't really know I don't know how to respond to that idea because I don't know the theology of the Eastern Orthodox churches that well.
And sort of in order to do that, well, it's a little easier for the Roman Catholic Church. It's a little easier for a confessional denomination like the Christian Reformed Church. The Eastern Orthodox Church, I don't know. Do they just sort of point to church fathers and say that's it? Or do you subscribe to something? I don't know. But it's kind of a low resolution question for a guy who doesn't like to live in low resolution.
I do know something about it. I know that the Eastern Orthodox churches stress the idea that the fundamental ethical responsibility of the individual is to become as Christ-like as possible.
Which is a very Protestant way of saying it because, well, Protestant churches think that. Roman Catholic thinks that. The whole, when Jonathan Peugeot talks about, theosis, the Roman Catholics are like, hey, that's ours too. And Protestants are like, we don't use those words, but that's pretty much what we believe. And he just gave a very Protestant articulation of that.
And I think that is the fundamental ethical responsibility, basically by definition, because at minimum, speaking psychologically, which is the safest way to speak about such things.
For him.
The figure of Christ is the ideal avatar of the good in the Western imagination.
And that's basically what he just laid out, the whole argument. And that's his religion. That's how he sees the world. Now, a lot of Christians, because they jump up to the top and say, I'm going to start at the top and move down, which isn't a bad way to do. It's sort of the way the direction the Bible takes. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. You kind of start there and you work down. Well, he doesn't. He starts at the bottom and he works his stairway to heaven up.
And thus, it's by definition that your ethical obligation is to imitate that in every way that's possible. And that's specified to some degree. It means to treat being itself with love, even your enemies.
Now, what's really interesting is, so Jordan just laid out this whole argument. To what degree is that argument dependent upon Christianity? Because that's where it's kind of, you start there and you end there. And, there's these little math tricks that you can play on people. You have people do all this addition and subtraction and multiplication, and then you wind up with the same answer. And is that the case for Jordan? If he started from a different cultural starting point, would his entire process of moving through Darwin, English person, all of Western civilization, he winds up with the answer given in Christian theology from very early on. Surprise. Is that fair? Or is it just logic?
To not wish them ill, but to wish the good for them as well. Treat being itself with love, even your enemies, to not wish them ill, but to wish the good for them as well, and to tell the truth, and to live by the dictates of your conscience, and that's the pathway to divinity. I think that's all true. So, I was deeply influenced in my thinking, as most of the people who are watching this would know, by Carl Jung, and he was certainly influenced by his knowledge of the Eastern Orthodox doctrine. And so I've been influenced by the Eastern Orthodox Church via that route.
In other words, just like all of us who learned from our parents and learned from our neighbors and learned from our culture, he says, yeah, so I learned from Carl Jung, who, of course, is part of this same whole system too. And so where my answers might differ a little bit, here we are.
I think that there isn't any more serious question than your relationship to the ideal, again, virtually by definition, and that there isn't anything better that you can do than attempt to embody that good as fully as possible. And I've tried to make a practical case for that, I suppose, and perhaps that's why, with respect for the idea, and perhaps that's why so many people from the Eastern Orthodox Church in particular seem to find resonance in my ideas.
Especially those in America or in Canada or in Australia or in the UK, because there's context there too.
Has my wife's burgeoning faith had an impact on my conception of God? Well, some impact. Tammy, my wife, has always taken the idea of truth very seriously. Her recent brush with death has deepened her religious sense and impelled her towards a life that's more consciously focused on service to others, her family in particular, but not only her family, people beyond the family. And I also think that's a function to some degree of our stage of life. She's a grandmother now, and her children are grown and able to take care of themselves, and so she can turn her attention to other people, maybe farther afield from the immediate family. I'm watching what she's doing and listening to her and watching her practical application of her faith. And
so in other words, he's still being mapped on. Now, he's a far more sophisticated person than he was when he was a little boy running around, northern Alberta. There's been lots of writing on his map, and so that changes because you don't just write on a fresh piece of paper when you're at this age and when you've had a 30-year relationship with your wife and on and all this stuff.
That affects me just as everything she does affects me, because I watch what she does and take it seriously. And her recent actions have indicated she's helped a number of people quite substantially in the recent past with a group that she's been communicating with, and all of that's very interesting to me. She's showing me, I've taken the idea of God seriously for a very long time, and I've said on multiple occasions,
the idea of God,
that I try to act as though God exists, and that's essentially my definition of belief. When people say, do you believe in God? Belief is a multi-dimensional word. And
now it's, again, you can see it's sort of a religion of his own logical making. He's not done. He's not worked on this with others in religious communities. One question is, well, what do you mean by believe? And for me, the proof of belief is to be found in action. And I decided that I would act as if God existed a long while back. And of course, I'm imperfect in that, inevitably. Now, she's doing that more explicitly as well.
Not she wasn't doing it quite well to begin with, but she's doing it more explicitly and also more within the confines of traditional religious conceptions. Although she's not attending church, she's associating with a number of people who are formally religious, and all of that's informing the way that she conducts herself.
So there's some distributed consciousness going on, but they're positioned in terms of, you know, where do you position yourself in terms of who you allow to influence you and to what degree? I mean, all of those questions about religion, identity flow out of there. And so, you know, many have noted that Tammy prays with the rosary, and that got talked about in Bishop Barron's interview. And so, but then a lot of attention is on Jordan. Will Jordan join the Roman Catholic Church? Because, again, I mean, I always get this question, you know, well, when am I going to join the Roman Catholic Church? Mark Galley waits until he's done being editor of the Christianity Today to join the Roman Catholic Church. I laughed hard when I read that. You see, there's a lot that goes into this because it is tied in with all these other things. And so I'm not saying I am, but in terms of Jordan, I haven't heard his answer change substantially. Now, this little tell that he gave with respect to God in that first video back that drew everyone's attention, well, it's a tell. But at some point, too, you're going to have to ask the question, okay, well, what would it mean if he and Tammy start attending a Roman Catholic church and formally join and take the Mass? What does that mean?
So it's watching her do that has also highlighted for me the missing praxis in Western Christianity. If you want to be a Christian, let's say, if you think that's necessary, it's not exactly obvious what you should do. You should go to church, but that's not,
as Jonathan Peugeot told him,
enough. I don't think it's.
And he had a lot of, you know, critique of the church, which he gave to Bishop Barron. And as you'll see in my conversation with Mark has critique of the church. And I always find that rather amusing because it's kind of like critiquing somebody else's marriage. It's really the view from the inside and the view from the outside are very different because these are powerful things. And I don't mean that like I'm offended at all. It's just fascinating. And those on the inside should listen to critique from the outside because that's valuable information, and I seek that information.
She's been involved with well, I think that's enough said about that for the time being.
Very interesting answer. Again, I don't know if it's clearer than answers he's given in the past or if I understand him better, but very interesting answer. And again, I remember listening to him carefully 3 years ago, and my categorization of him was sort of an open agnostic. Now, I've done a lot of thinking, you know, Tom Holland came on the scene since then, and thinking about the relationship between secularity and Christianity and the ways in which we are deeply embedded in our context. I've been talking about that with Rafe Kelly. So, yeah, very interesting, very, very interesting answer. So I hope my commentary shed a little bit of extra light on it for you. Again, if you were annoyed by the fact that I interrupted him for 19 minutes and 19 seconds, you can listen to the original. So thanks for watching.